Masechet Menaḥot Daf Non He Tenor Rabbanan Tormin Te'enim Al HaGrogrot B'makom sheregilin la'asot te'enim grogrot ve'lo grogrot al te'enim ve'afilu b'makom sheregilim la'asot te'enim grogrot. One can separate fresh dates from dried dates if you live in a place where people generally take fresh dates and dry them out. There's a regular industry that are doing that. The reason that you can do that is because, objectively, fresh dates are better, higher quality than dry dates, all other things being equal. In other words, if you can eat it right away, then fresh dates are considered better. And you can always take from better produce, give that to the Kohanim and Leviim, and here we're talking about Terumah, and give that to the Kohanim. You can always give the better thing to the Kohanim, and by that permit the lesser, objectively lesser quality item. So for sure, you can use Te'enim and give that to the Kohen, make that Terumah for Grogrot. However, that's only in a place where it would be easy to dry out the te'enim so that the kohen who receives it, if he can't eat them right away, he can always take them to the fig dryer and dry them out, and then they will last long. So there's no downside here. That's permitted. However, you cannot give the kohen the grogrot for te'enim, because then you're giving the lower quality item to permit the higher quality item. And that would be true even in a place where one regularly takes te'enim and makes them grogrot, and you could say, well, anyway, probably the te'enim that you're permitting are probably going to be made into dry figs anyway, but no, that doesn't matter. Right now, you cannot take the lower quality for the higher quality. Amar Mor, Tormin te'enim al hagrogrot makom sheregilin la'asot te'enim grogrot, b'makom sheregilin in, b'makom she'en regilin la. We're going to point out that there seems to be an internal contradiction in this baraita, because first you said that you can take from the fresh figs to permit the dried figs as long as it's a place where they are accustomed to dry out figs. That means, yes, in a place where they're accustomed to dry them out, you can. But if you live in a place where they're not accustomed to do so, no, you cannot do that, because then you're giving the kohen the fresh figs, but they're going to spoil before he gets a chance to eat them. Now, what would be the case? If you're talking about a place where there is a kohen, he's present, he's right there, down the block, then what's the problem? Even if it's not a place where they generally dry the figs, but the kohen's right there, so you can separate it, and you'll give it to him right away, and he'll eat them. And so there's no problem that they're going to spoil. In fact, we have a Mishnah Masechet Turumot that says when there is a kohen nearby, then you should always give from the better item, and even though it's fresh and will spoil relatively quickly, but the kohen's right there, so as long as you give it to him right away, then you're good to go. And so it can't be talking about a case where there is a kohen, because then you wouldn't need to be a place where they generally dry things. Ela peshita deleka kohen. Rather, the Resha must be talking about a case where there is no kohen available. There's no kohen in the village. And so if I separate right now from the fresh figs for the dried figs, and I'm going to keep them on the side over here until, maybe next week a kohen's going to come through, and by that time they will be already spoiled. And so that's why it has to be a place where they can be regularly dried, because then you can save them by drying them. So clearly, the Resha is talking about where there is no kohen. Ema sefa, but that conclusion seems to contradict the next part of the baraita that said velo grogrot ala te'enim va'afilu b'makom sheragil la'asot te'enim grogrot. Here it says that you cannot separate out dried figs to permit fresh figs, even in a place where they generally do dry things out. Now, ve'i deleka kohen amayla. If there's no kohen there, and you just established that the Resha is where there's no kohen, but in this case, if there's no kohen, why not? V'hatenan makom she'en kohen toreh min hamitkayem. The Mishnah in Masechet Turumot says that if you're in a place where there's no kohen, you can separate out something that will endure, because there is no kohen, and if you separate out fresh produce for terumah, then it's going to go bad. So even though it's of lesser quality, if there's no kohen, it would be allowed, because at least it will not spoil. Ela peshita dika kohen. So it must be that the second half of the braita that says it's not allowed and you have to take fresh is when there is a kohen, because then you can give it to him. So now we have the resha there's no kohen, and the sefa has to be where there is a kohen. Resha deleka kohen, sefa dika kohen. Could that be? And the answer is yes. In resha deleka kohen, sefa dika kohen. Sometimes it happens that a mishnah, the beginning and the end, is talking about two different cases, although it's implied and not said explicitly. Amar papa shema'amina dahkinan umokminan matnitin betre ta'ameh vela mokminan betre tana'eh. The papa says we can learn from this discussion that one can interpret a mishnah as being according to two different reasonings or two different scenarios, and do not, rather than say it's two different tanaim, that anonymous two sections of an anonymous mishnah or baraita are talking about are the opinion of two different tanaim, and it doesn't say that they're arguing with each other. That is a much worse, that's a much more difficult interpretation than to assume that the two halves are talking about different cases. Next Mishnah, Kol Menaḥot niloshin befoshrin umeshamaran shelo yachmisu. All korban mincha offerings, though most of them that have to be made into matzah and not chametz, one will knead it with warm water, lukewarm water. Lukewarm water is the best for mixing, and you have to watch it to make sure it does not become chametz. And if it does become chametz, even if it's just the leftovers, the remainder after the kometz that becomes chametz, one violates a lo ta'aseh. Shenemar kol hamincha shetakribu ladonai lo ta'aseh chametz. And we learn this from the pasuk that says all meal offerings that are given to Hashem, one cannot make them chametz. And one would be liable separately to flogging for kneading it once it becomes chametz, or for shaping it, or for baking it once it becomes chametz. What is the source for this? Amar Lakish, Amar Kera, lo te'afeh chametz chelkam, afilu chelkam lo te'afeh chametz. What's the source that even a portion of it, even the sheyareha, even the leftover that becomes chametz, one will be liable? So how do you know? I mean, just from this pasuk it says that the whole thing don't make it chametz. But how do you know that even a portion of it? Because the pasuk says, "Do not bake it as chametz chelkam." Here is the full pasuk: "Lo tafeh chametz chelkam natati otam meishai." So in Peshat, these are two different sections. Do not bake it as leaven. I have given it to them for their portion of my offerings made by fire. So that's a separate section. But if you ignore the ta'amim, you can read it lo tafeh chametz chelkam. Even a portion of it cannot become chametz. Now the Gemara asks, "V'hai lahachihu de'ata hai mi'ba'ale lichdetanya." This pasuk, lo tafeh chametz, is it really coming to teach me that even a portion, even the leftover part that the kohanim would eat, if it becomes chametz, one violates? Is that what this pasuk is coming to teach? We have another baraita that says it's coming to teach something else. That says in the baraita, lo te'afeh chametz, same pasuk, matamod omar, halo kvar nemar lo te'aseh chametz. Why do you have to say don't bake it as chametz? It already says don't make it chametz. Lefi shene'emar lo te'aseh chametz yachol lo yeheh chayav ela achat al kulam. Because if I had only the pasuk that says don't make it chametz, I would think that one is liable only one count for all of the actions, kneading, shaping, baking the dough. I was only liable one set of lashes. Talmud Omar lo te'afeh afiyah bichlal hayta lama yasat. That's why the pasuk says do not bake it. Now baking is included in the process of making. So why is it focused on? Why is it enumerated as something separate? להקיש עליה, to make a היקש. מאפייה מיוחדת שהיא מעשה יחידי וחברין עליה בפני עצמה, אף אני אביא לישתה ועריכתה. So to learn from it that just as baking is a single action, and one is liable for baking by itself, because that's what the pasuk says, don't even bake it. So too, I will compare that to the other single actions like kneading and shaping, and say that each one, once it becomes chametz, and you do each of these three items, then you're liable to 3 counts. וכל מעשה יחידי שבה, להטויה כיתוף, שהוא מעשה יחידי, והכווין עליה בפני עצמה. And furthermore, the Braita says, any single action that's a self-included action, including smoothing out the surface of the dough with water, and the one is also liable to that if it became chametz and you do that action. So all that is a question, because we see that any of these, that this pasuk, lo te'afeh chametz, chelkam, is coming to teach me that one is liable for every action that one does when it's chametz. So you can't use the same pasuk also to teach you that even a portion that becomes chametz, but one is liable. So the answer is anan me chelkam kamrinan. No, we're learning just from the word chelkam. The previous drasha was from lo te'afeh chametz, but the word chelkam, that teaches me that even a portion that becomes chametz is prohibited and liable. How do you know? Maybe the entire pasuk lo te'afeh chametz chelkam, maybe that entire section is coming to teach me this what the Braita says, that for every stage one is liable. In ken nichtob chelkam lo te'afeh, mai lo te'afeh chametz chelkam, shemat mina terteh. No, if it was all coming to teach me that one law, then it would have been written chelkam lo te'afeh chametz, the portion shall not be baked with leaven. And then that baked is telling you that the same is true for all the other actions that one does. But the fact that it puts chelkam at the end, that means that one can learn two things from it. Lo te'afeh chametz, and the fact that chelkam is at the end is saying, and even if it's only a portion, still one is liable. Ve'ema afiya defarat barachamana lichayev hada inach lichayev hada kulehu. Now we ask about that baraita. Why not say that regarding baking, where the Torah specifies that one, if you bake it as chametz, then one will be liable for a count of lashes for doing that. But the other items like kneading and shaping and smoothing, maybe one is liable for all of them from the lo ta'aseh chametz. How do you know from the pasuk of afiyah that also applies to each of the others? Mishum davad dabashir bichlal v'yasa min hakilal lelamed lo lelamed ala smo yasa lelamed ala kilal kolo yasa. The answer is because this fits into one of the methodologies by which the Torah is interpreted, that says any item that is within a general category, and yet the Torah specifies it, even though it's in the general category, so that means it's teaching you something, not about itself only, but also about all the other things that are in that category. And so that, therefore, here, you have the category of lo ta'aseh, do not make something that's chametz, and then afiyah, which is included in that. So that means it's specified to teach not only about itself, but about all the other specific activities that one is liable for each activity by itself. Vema lo te'aseh kelal lo te'afeh perat. Kelal u'perat en bakelal ela ma sheba perat. Now, why fit these pisukim into this rule called davar sheya bichlal and so on? Why not say that lo te'aseh is the generality, and lo te'afeh is one particular item that one is within the category of making, and treat this as a klal uprat. And the rule is that anytime you have a generality and then a particular, then we include only the particular and we ignore the generality. And then we would come to the conclusion that one is liable lashes only for baking or korban mincha as hametz, just for the baking, but not for any of the other steps. And danin otan bikelal uperat. And bi'a petoriki says, because this is a klal uprat that are far away from each other. A klal uprat has to be back to back, within the same one phrase right after the other phrase. Then we apply klal uperat. But these are far away from each other. The pasuk that says that should not be made is in Vayikra chapter 2, and the one that says shall not be baked is in Vayikra chapter 6. These are way far apart. So that's why we do not use kelal uprat here. Mativ Rav Ada bar Ahava amri la kiti uklal uprat menuchakin zemize and danin otan biklal uprat. Now we ask about this rule of Rabbi Apetoriki, who said that we do not apply klal uprat when they're far away. Says, is that true? Rava asks, and some say that it's an anonymous question, that if they're far away, we do not apply klal uprat. Look at this b'raita, v'tanya, v'shachat oto b'mkom asher yishchat ha'olah lifnei Adonai hatat hi. Pasuk in Vayikra 4:24 says about the king who makes an error and he has to bring a goat as a sin offering. It says the Kohen shall do shechita in the place that that he does shechita on the korban olah. Olah is done in the north. So too, this chatat has to be done in the north. Hechan olah nishchetet basafon avzeh basafon. Just like an olah is in the north, so too this particular sin offering has to be in the north. The Braita continues and says, "V'chi anu mikan lemedin." Are we really going to learn it from here? There's another pasuk in Vayikra chapter 6 that says, in a place where a burnt offering is slaughtered, sin offering is also slaughtered. So that is teaching the same thing in a more general way. So why is the law of a king excluded and mentioned in particular? If I know this is true about every korban chatat, lekov'o shim lo shachat oto b'safon pesalo, to establish it, to fix this place and teach you that if it's not, even b'di avad, if you did it somewhere outside of the north, then it's invalid. Not only lechetechila, in other words, this pasuk in Vayikra 6 you might think that that's only lechetechila, do it there, but b'di avad maybe it's still okay. So we have the pasuk regarding the king that says even b'di avad, if you did it outside the north, it would be invalid. Now we ask, wait, how do you know that it's coming to teach you that even b'diavad is no good? Maybe the pasuk about the king is coming to teach you that that's the only type of korban chatat that has to be in the north and not any other. Now, why would we think that? It seems to be treating it kind of like a kilal uprat, and therefore only the pirat. We'll see in a second. And that's why we have now yet a third pasuk. This is in the next paragraph after the king. It says one will do shechita on the chatat in the same that one did the korban olah. Ze binyan av l'chol chataot sheteunot safon, and that will be a paradigm for all korban chatat offerings, and teach me that they have to all be done in the north. Now, in the step before we bring this 429, while we're still comparing the one from 424 to 618, so at that point, before we could make this conclusion, we analyze. It's only because of this pasuk in 429 that says that we know that every korban chatat has to be in the north. Halav hachi, but before that, without that, hava amina shezeh ta'un safon ve'en acher ta'un safon. My ta'ama. At the point before, the Baraita had thought that only the king's sa'ir, korban chatat, has to be in the north and no others. What was its reasoning? Lav mishum dava kilal uperat ve'af agab demiruchakin ze mizeh daninotan bichlal ufrat. Maybe it was treating it as a kilal uprat, that in 618 it says all korban chatat, and in 424 it says just the king, and that's a klal upirat. And even though these are far away from there, 2 chapters apart, and yet it treats it as a klal upirat. So isn't that's a question against the previous statement of Rabbi Petoriki, who said that a klal uprat cannot be done when it's far away, but here they are far away, and this Braita seems to be learning a klal uprat. Matkif la Rav Asher. Rav Asher objects to that objection. Hai klal upiratu, piratu kilalu, v'naseh kilal mosif ala pirat, v'yitrebe lehu kol mileh. Rav Asher says, no, this would not, even if it were accepted that far away is okay, this is not a klal upirat, it goes the other way around, it's a pirat uklal, because it goes in order, and Vayikra 4 is the pirat, it was about the king, and Vayikra 6 is the generality, so if anything it would be a pirat uklal, and the rule there is that if you have a particular followed by a generality, then the generality it comes to include everything, and that would mean that everything is included. So this would not fit anyway, even if you accepted that far away is okay. This is not a parat ukelal. Ela tana oto kakashyale v'achi ka'amar o eno ela sheze ta'un safon ve'en and acher ta'un tzafon v'katav rachamana oto. Rather, the Tana was focusing on the word oto in chapter 4, pasuk 24, regarding the Sa'ir of the king, and was suggesting as follows: perhaps the chatat of the king has to be in the north, and no other one has to be done in the north, and that's why it says the word oto, and that's why it brings the third pasuk from 429 that comes to be more inclusive and say, oh no, this is actually a binyan av, and all of them are required to be in the north. Now that we learned that korban chatat offerings have to be done in the north from the pasuk v'shachat et hachatat, indeed the word oto that's mentioned by the king, what does that come to exclude? Menaḥot oto basafon ve'en sir nachshon basafon. Gemara answers is coming to exclude that these korbanot, the korban of a king, has to be in the north, but the sa'ir that Nachshon brought during the consecration of the Mishkan, that does not have to be in the north. The Gemara will continue a long discussion about this. That discussion follows a mnemonic Nachshon v'shachat of Pesach Siman, but that takes us well into the next daf, and so we'll pick up on this point tomorrow. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.